My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to cover the essential concept of Upanishad. I'm going to continue, and then this will give you the kind of fundamentals of the Upanishads. And next week I will start on one of the Upanishads, which is the Katha Upanishad. But I just want to give you the fundamentals. I gave last, I think, before we broke away for Christmas and New Year's, we covered some elements of it. So we will continue with that. And so before I start, I wish all of you all a happy New Year to all of you all, and wish this year will be a productive year, a peaceful, and a help you discover your own life journey and attain an enlightened life. So let me review what we covered the last time, and then we will go into more new materials, right? So we are going to cover in this series the essential concepts of Upanishad. So let me give you the kind of fundamentals of it, so that when we go into the Upanishad, you'd understand the language. So we covered the last time the 6 states of evolution of the human mind. And I covered extensively how one prepares oneself for acquiring the wisdom, knowledge of not just the Upanishad, but any scriptures or any knowledge, including your own professional knowledge and study, right? So one needs to have the devotion, intensive devotion to whatever you do, and that leads to a disciplined mind. And in this context, a disciplined mind starts slowly cultivating the habits, and that will give one the divine qualities, and the divine qualities enable us to make discoveries of the things around us, the universe around us, our own body, our mind, our intellect, and it helps us to become an explorer, and we make new discoveries. So whether it's in about our own self, or whether it's in our own relationships or our own professional life, you see that this devotion, discipline, divine qualities enable us to discover that explorer. And this is where we start seeing development, both in a spiritual realm, professional realm, in our family life, in our social life. And you see that slowly we have a more enriched experience of life, and ultimately helps us to lead a divine, a life of full enrichment, and that it reveals that divinity in all of us. And you see that as the divinity enhances, we see that our devotion intensify, and the whole cycle becomes more and more intensive, that ultimately it leads us to that the difference, the difference between the creator, the creating process, and the creation becomes one. The knower, the knowing process, and the known all becomes one. And this is what the non-duality state, right? So we spoke about this extensively in the last 2 satsangs. I also spoke about the key concepts of the Upanishad, and the Upanishad focuses a lot on this notion of the Atman, or the self, what is the ultimate reality, and how one discovers that ultimate reality. To do that, one needs to understand what consciousness is. And so you'll see in all the Upanishad, it kind of unpacks the notion of consciousness, or chit. There's Upanishads that also speak about death, and that's one of the Upanishads that we will cover in the beginning of Katha Upanishad, which is about the conversation with the Lord of Death. And here we see that if you understand death really well, you'll understand life. And in that process of understanding death and life, you see that we attain liberation, moksha. And ultimately, we understand the nature of what existence is all about. What is eternal and what is transitory. So again, you see that this is the objective of the Upanishad. And here again, you see that as we get deeper understanding, we shift from the ritualistic religious practices that leads us eventually to philosophical inquiries and inner experience, from the achara to vichara. So the acharas helps us to build discipline, acquire the discipline to be able to go deeper, to understand, that introspective, the experience of God. So again, the rituals and the religious practice are so important. They are fundamental to the next stages of evolution. So the achara to vichara. And there are many scriptures within the Upanishad that actually takes us through that evolution. They have the principal Upanishad, the minor Upanishad, and then the yoga tantra based Upanishads, that teaches us about the power centers or chakras and kundalini and meditation and all the other asanas through the hatha yoga that helps us to get a deeper understanding of our own self. So again, I spoke about the last discussion was that, in the Upanishad, it talks about the states of consciousness, and it talks about the waking state, the dream state, the deep sleep state, and also the fourth state, which is Turiya state. And I'll go a little bit more deeper in our unpacking. And you'll see this a lot in this Upanishad. In all the Upanishads, it talks about what is the waking state. Is it the real or unreal, Maya, and all those things. Maypurul and Mayapurul. The same thing. What is dream? What is deep sleep? And what is the fourth stage, which is Turiya state? And you probably would have heard, and I'll speak about it a little bit more in depth. So now I'm going to go a little bit more in terms of what these states are. If you see that there are different levels of kind of uh, cosmic level. So we spoke about the absolute or the Brahman, and then you have that second stage, which is the Ishvara or universal consciousness, the creative spirit in the English term. So Brahman is the absolute state. The second one is the Ishvara or universal consciousness, the creative spirit that is embedded in all of us. And then the third stage is what they call the Hiranyagarbha universal. It's the universal mind, the world spirit, the whole cosmic intelligence. And Virat is actually the cosmos itself. So you'll see these terms used a lot in the Upanishads, and it has several meanings to this. So the Brahman, you see the absolute, is what sometimes in the individual self or the subject level is depicted as the Atman or the pure self. So you have to remember in the Advaita teachings, it talks about everything is a manifestation of that absolute, and it manifests in different states of existence. As I said, I gave the example of the electricity. The power generator will have a different intensity, but when it comes to our home, it has a different intensity. Though the intensity is different, the DNA is still the same. So in this state, you see that it talks about the Brahman. So in the individual state, we see that it's pure self, and this is what is depicted to as the Turiya state, the blissful state. So you'll see in all the Upanishads, they talk about this pure self. So the absolute in the individual self, it manifests as the Atman or the pure self. So sometimes people get confused with the terminology that is used. It's like electricity that is 33 kilowatts in the power generator, in the source, but in our home, it's 240 watts. So it's that kind of analysis. And the state that we have is actually the state of Turiya, which is actually the blissful state, that kind of state that is transcendental, that often used in most of the literature, or the universal state that. So you see that the Brahman absolute in the individual self, or what we call the subjective state, is the pure self. In the form, there is no form for that. It is formless. And then that state is also called the blissful state. The second one is actually the Ishvara, which is the universal consciousness or the creative spirit. This is actually sometimes you'll see the term used prajna, which is actually the individual self, the intellectual self. That which what we call the karana sharira. So here are some of the terminology. So this is what we call the causal body. Like you think, and then you see that the thinking leads to an action. So we see this, what we call the causal body. So this is happens in that sushupti state, which is the deep sleep state, where one experiences that that unarvu or the vibration at the purest state. So you have the pure self, and then you have the intellectual self that experiences this vibration. And then the third one is actually what we call the Hiranyagarbha, the universal mind, or what we call the world spirit. So this is the mental self. So this one is sometimes known as the Linga Sarira, or the subtle body. So here is related to the swapna, the dream state. Dream here is actually not only uh, people dream in the sleep state, but also dream in the waking state of having this mental state of the aspirations and all those things, and then they translate that into actions. And of course, the fourth state is what we call Virat, or the cosmos. And this is the universe and all the elements of the universe, your helium and oxygen and nitrogen and all these things that were formed during the crucible of the birth of the universe, or you can call it the Big Bang, when all these elements came to existence that form everything in this universe, from the stars to the galaxies to the planets, the moons, including our own physical body. And this, we experience this in the wakeful state. And so if you see that the four states that we talked about, the waking state, the dream state, the deep sleep state, and the fourth state, is mapped very nicely in all the Upanishads in the form of that individual level or the subjective side, the form. So you see, absolute, the Brahman has no form, you see, whereas all of them, all the others have some form or of existence, and so that's captured by the four states that you will see later on when we cover the Upanishads. So this is really important because that leads us very nicely in the Upanishads and about the 5 sheets model of our human personality. The first one is actually sometimes known as the Annamaya Kosha, which is our physical body, which all of us experience. It goes through changes, because of the elements of what the nature has built, in the cosmos. So we have all the elements that comprises in our body, that what we have in same proportion, we have it in the universe. So you can say that the body is part of the physical, universe. So this is the human personality. The second one is actually, you see that the physical body, but we go deeper, it is made out of all the energy that supports life. Without this energy, the ability for us to consume food, metabolize food, convert food into different elements of, genetic code and blood and all those things. These are the elements of the universe that make up our body. So it's a more subtle version from the gross body to the energial body level. Again, this is the discussion within Upanishad. So you see the Upanishad is very scientific, very logical, and the way it unpacks the reality. The third one is actually Manomaya Kosha, which is actually the mental state, and the mental state that thoughts and emotions arise. So here, the mental state, that thoughts and emotional state, that give rise to, all our thoughts and, how it impacts our emotional state and so on. So, so again, our human personality is touched by, is influenced by our mental state. Of course, the fourth one is our intellectual capacity, the ability to differentiate between what is real and unreal, what is permanent and impermanent, what is mortal and immortal, all those things, the ability to discriminate. So we call it the viveka quality that we have. Right? Of course, the intellect is really important for us ultimately to sift out what are the things that helps us to make sense of the world. Right? So we have that element. And then, of course, we have the Anandamaya Kosha, which is actually the blissful state, the state where one gets pretty close to the Atman. Sometimes we say the approximation, the best approximation to the Atman. Because to get to the Atman, as long as we have that human personality, it is hard to experience it unless we completely dissolve it. So Anandamaya Kosha talks about actually the blissful state, pretty close to the Atman state, the peaceful universal state. And of course, there are different traditions of the schools of thought that the Advaita said we are that. The Dvaita states, actually, the Dvaita school of thought says that the bhakti leads to jnana, and as jnana leads to bhakti, and eventually we'll get to the pretty close state of the Atman, but not the Atman itself. So different schools of thought have different perspective, but I don't want to get into semantics, but I will just want to tell you that the Anandamaya Kosha is this blissful state that you get pretty close to this state of this Atman, or as we said earlier, the absolute state. Remember, the absolute state is the cosmic level, whereas the Atman state is at the subjective level, the individual level. So the individual is an approximation of the absolute or the Brahman state. So again, going to this state, you see that in the Upanishad slowly unpacks one by one like an onion, right? And ultimately, what's the core of this? So again, you see that in this, it also speaks about the mental function of, the human personality. And you'll see why some people are able to get it and some don't, because the different states of, one's realization. So the Upanishads slowly starts with this course on understanding the universe and takes you step by step to the inner realm. So here again, you'll see that a lot of questions and queries come on the universe, and of course, where does the universe come from, and how does the universe get constructed? So everything, that one wants to know about the universe, the creator, the creation process, and the creation itself, it all starts with the mind. So Upanishad brings back to where does all these queries come from? And it's the human mind. And let's understand what the human mind is. What is the human mind? So it's like a scientist trying to define all these things, the different layers of our, mental state. And say, what is the mind? The mind is that which generates thoughts and perceptions and queries. So what is thought? Thought is actually a measure of experience of this material world. So it's a measure of experience. So this is what the mind is. So remember that the mind is that which that generates thoughts, measures of experiences that we have of this material universe that we live in. Then there's a second part is the buddhi. It says, okay, we know what these thoughts are, what thoughts that are real and what thoughts that are not real, right? So the buddhi now, through this experiential understanding and learning, starts discriminating what is real and unreal. So it starts, having this quality of viveka, the ability to discriminate so that we can make decisions, so that we know what is transitory, that we experience it, but it's not going to be everlasting. And what is it that when we experience it, it's going to have an everlasting effect, right? So the buddhi is that which discriminates and helps us make decisions that will have an everlasting, eternal impact, right? So the Upanishad gives a lot of emphasis on the mind, because the whole idea of enlightenment and understanding starts with the mind, nothing else, right? And then how the mind, how it generates the thoughts and experiences, and how the buddhi or the intellect, how to cultivate and sharpen the intellect to be able to differentiate between the thoughts and the experiences that are real and unreal. So again, there's a fair bit of introspection that takes place in this practice. So this understanding this mental process is really important. Also, the third one is actually about our ego. This is also very important. So you'll see that the Upanishad speaks about understanding our ahangara, which is ego. So it's actually that which gives the state of individual identity and reference to oneself, who we are, what we are. So again, sometimes the term ego is used in is not used in the best possible way. Often we think ego is pride. Actually, it's not pride. It's actually about our state of our individual identity, right? So do we, how do we associate, how do we associate who we are, that individual identity? Remember, we had that cosmic level, but this is at the individual level or the subjective level, who we are. And of course, there are some that associate themselves with their body, some associate with their wealth, some associate with their all the other material things. So again, what is the reference to yourself, or titles and so on. But you see that when the intellect is sharp and cultivate the viveka, it'll be able to separate between what is transitory and what is permanent. So again, and through that process, one understands truly the state of that individual identity. And you see that with a very blunted intellect, one associates things to the material things that are always fleeting and transitory. So when things change, the mind is unable to grapple with it and has an unsettling effect. But when the intellect is able to differentiate between real and unreal, and the mind anchors on that real, you see that the individual identity converges to that cosmic identity. So one's reference becomes not transition from the material to that universal identity. And that's what the Upanishad takes us through. It also speaks about the memory, how one can cultivate the memory. Remember, the memory is the knowledge bank that stores our experiences and all the memories that we have. So it's a knowledge bank. So here it is that is really important. How do we ensure that our memory bank is strong and deep and wide, so that we're able to associate every experience, every thought, make reference like a library to say what is permanent, what is impermanent, what is transitory, what is eternal, what is mortal, what is immortal. So we have all those experiences, and the buddhi rationalizes it and stores it, so that when we are confronted with a particular experience of thought, we're able to sift off in such a way that those thoughts and experiences don't impact us. So it's like building a library that is well resourced, but well documented and well stored with good references, so that when you come up with something, those knowledge can be used to make that understanding. So the chitta is very important. So in this whole process of this mental function, you see that a lot of focus on the Upanishads about the mind and the intellect, and understanding what the ahangara is, the ego, what is our true identity, and how do we build this knowledge bank so that it is deep and wide to help us navigate through this thing, this journey called life, without being impacted by this. So again, you'll see in all the conversations in the Upanishad between the guru and the disciple, the guru takes through the disciple through understanding the mind, how to utilize the intellect, how to understand one's state of that individual identity and that cosmic identity, and how do we close that gap, and how do we build that knowledge that helps us to close that gap and helps us to attain that convergence. Of course, in this context, you see that there are a few things that as we go through this understanding, the Upanishad takes us through that evolution of the human mind to build that mental power so that it's resilient and not impacted by the different states of our own experiences. So again, we see that it helps us to build that wisdom, the wisdom knowledge. What is that? The intuitive knowledge, the rational thought, have a scientific and logical reasoning of things, of how causation impacts, the causality. When you do this, when you do A, what happens? How does B arise? And so on. So really having that intuitive knowledge. It also teaches about Shraddha, the faith. Remember, I spoke about devotion, right? How do we have that inner conviction to search for the truth that helps us to expand and deepen the mind and help the mind go deeper within itself to really understand the power of the human mind and not be distracted by the fleeting worldly experience. So the Upanishad takes us through that. It also teaches us about dhyana, which is the meditative state, how to not just meditate in a short period of time and get that nice feeling, but also how do we sustain these experiences over time so that over long term we become aware of who we are, the true identity that, that from transitioning from that individual identity and making that convergence towards that universal identity. And finally, the dhyana over time takes us through this absorptive state, the samadhi state, which is ultimately understanding the knower, the knowing process, and the known. They all become one. So again, we see that why that is really important. So the Upanishad actually takes us through that conversation between the guru and the disciple, takes that confused disciple with a lot of queries through this journey of building the wisdom, that faith, and helping them become more peaceful through meditation, and then ultimately leading to that absorptive state, that oneness state. So again, we see this, and they teach the different state of yoga and how to initiate the transformation. So not just giving the theoretical knowledge, but it teaches the disciple on what you need to do to go through this evolution and the transformation of the human personality. So again, for me, I found this Upanishad really amazing because it just lays down in a logical and systematic and scientific way of everything in this external cosmos and the internal cosmos in all of us, and then provides a way for us to go deeper from the external to the internal and ultimately make sense of both the internal and external cosmos. You see that they become one. So in this process, you see that this practice that they teaches you helps you to reduce the distraction of the material world. So again, it teaches how to meditate, how to introspect, contemplate, reflect, and ultimately leads to that, reducing the sukha dukkha cycles. And, there are times that you go through challenges. How do we become inspired by the wisdom, knowledge, not to be impacted by it? So what are the things that we need to do? The same thing, there are moments that we have really fantastic things, exuberance, and how do we manage those cycles so that over time the fluctuating cycles become more and more dampened, and it leads us to what we call that mental focus and concentration. When we are distracted, it is hard for us to focus. It's hard for us to have that equanimity. The equanimity is very important to move to the next stage of development. So many people get, they're so caught up with this material world that ultimately it's hard for them to meditate and it's hard for them to concentrate. So you see that the energy the brain uses and the mind uses become dissipated because you're so busy. The mind is so working so much that the bandwidth starts reducing and eventually you cannot do it. So this practice in the Upanishads and all the other practices teaches us to reduce the distraction of the material, allocate time to introspect on, very, very carefully of the wisdom, knowledge, then how do we incorporate that? How do we bring it into our meditational concentration form to achieve that sublimity and calmness? And that leads to the meditation. So as I said, introspection, contemplation, reflection, and it leads to what we call the dhyana state. So instead of having so many thoughts, it now helps us to come to that one optional thought. So the brain can build its bandwidth with just one optional thought. So this becomes like the training wheels, the foundation. Instead of having many, many thoughts, everything is anchored on this. And that's what the meditational practice teaches us. Whatever meditation you practice, the objective of that is to reduce that distraction, give you focus, and enable you to get that optional thought so that the bandwidth in the brain and eventually the mind that, experiences this material world, the bandwidth expands. And when the bandwidth expands, now the mind has the power to go inwards to make sense of the most subtlest things of its own existence. So that dhyana leads ultimately to the transcendental state. And you'll see that state of oneness. So again, you see that in the Upanishad, the Guru actually teaches that wisdom, knowledge of what that permanent and impermanent and how to attain that permanent state and through these various practices. So you see this across in all the Upanishads of how it's not just knowing it theoretically, but actually the practice to experience it. So it becomes an experiential knowledge that how one transition from that subjective experience of lots of knowings to that subjective experience of that quietude, and that quietude leads to the cosmic level experience of that absolute or the Brahman. So we see this Upanishad taking us through this understanding, and throughout the discussion in all the Upanishad, I will flag you that this is what that Guru is trying to explain to the disciple on how to reduce the distraction, how to have the focus, how to bring to that optional state, and ultimately only through that optional state one attains that state of oneness that the Advaita school teaches, that non-duality state. Otherwise, without this evolution, you see that not just duality, you see multiplicity, you see so caught up, the mind gets fragmented in many, many ways. How do we unify it and come to that one state of samadhi? So here it is. The Upanishad covers all this, and you'll see this in our discussion. But what's the difference between the Upanishad and that Western way of looking at the psychology of the human mind? So again, the Western discussion, what we call the waking state, the Western view is actually about behavior, cognition, and emotions. It's all about the waking state. The majority of it is about the waking state, although some of the Western view is slowly, tapping into the Eastern philosophies of understanding mindfulness and all these different things. But primarily, a lot of the Western view is focused on the waking state, how our behavior, cognition, emotions, how we interact with the material world, and so on. So this is the Western perspective. Or even if you see yoga, the Western perspective is how do we attain relaxation and so on. Whereas the Upanishads perspective is that it covers all the four states. It covers the waking state, trying to make sense of how we cognize the universe, why we cognize the universe in such a way, right? It also gives us a very good understanding of the dream state, what happens in the dream state. It also takes us through the deep sleep state, how one can attain that quietude and what is the quietude means and how do we attain that quietude in the human mind, and ultimately it takes us to the fourth state of the Turiya, which is the transcendental state. So the Upanishad covers all those four states of existence. So if you have studied psychology in the Western tradition, you probably would have covered a lot of things on behavior, cognition, emotions. And I did study some psychology at the university level. They cover all these things. Of course, there are some philosophers in the Western world, like Jung and others, that talk about what consciousness is all. But a majority of it is covering things in this realm: behavior, cognition, emotion. If you go into the Eastern philosophy, Upanishad is one of them. There are other Eastern philosophy talks about all the four states of existence and how one makes sense of this material universe. The creator, the creation process, and the creation itself, and how it unifies all of this. So this is what we will cover. So in that Upanishad. So today, I would just want to give you that language that you would be using and as we go through this journey of Katha Upanishad and Kena Upanishad and all the other Upanishads. I hope that you have that now, the vocabulary to understand when I cover things such as, Brahman. What does Brahman means? It means cosmic, at the cosmic level, the absolute. At the individual level, it's the pure self. Of this one attains that at the Turiya level. You also hear this word called Ishvara, or the universal cosmic or the creative spirit, which is the what we call the intellectual self, and again, the same thing with Hiranyagarbha. It's a term that is used a lot, which is the universal mind or the world spirit or the cosmic spirit, right? And the last one is actually you'll see that Virat, or the cosmos itself, so you will see this in many of the Upanishads that cover. So I hope I've given you the kind of a fundamentals of the Upanishad that we will start from next week onwards covering. We'll start the Katha Upanishad, which is a very exciting Upanishad. At least for me, it is one of the most profound Upanishad that had major transformation and understanding for me of the waking state, the dream state, the deep sleep state, and the final state, which is the Turiya state. With that, Sandosham. Thank you.